Hello everyone, welcome to the Excel workshop for Finance 320. Today we're going to go through a number of problems that are comparable to the ones that you'll see on your Excel test for Finance 320. We're going to look at step-by-step how to perform these functions in Excel. And today we're going to be using Excel 2016 for Windows. Now, if you have another version of Excel for Windows, this one will probably be pretty comparable. However, Excel 2016 is the version of Excel that you'll be working with if you're using any of the computers on the Menlo campus, the Windows computers, such as the ones in the Bronner classroom. So it's very useful to be familiar with this version of Excel. So to start off, I've pulled up a blank workbook page here. And before I do anything, I'm going to go ahead and just save my file by clicking Save As, and then naming it according to the instructions. I like to go ahead and do this first because now that I've saved this copy, as I'm working, if I want to go ahead and save the work that I've completed, I can just go up here to the save icon and click it. In Excel, unlike in Google Sheets or some other programs, it doesn't always save automatically. So it's a good idea to just go ahead and hit save periodically to make sure that you don't lose any of your work. So let's get to it. We're going to go over here and start with question number 1. And the first part asks me to generate a set of at least 30 coordinates or XY values for the following function, using the domain x is greater than -25 and less than 25. So I'm just going to go ahead over here and create a table. I'm going to add a header for my x values and my y values. For my x values, that's my independent variable, so I can just generate a set of whatever coordinates I want as long as they're within the specified domain. So I can just start from -24 and keep going. Now, I don't want to have to type in every single number, so luckily Excel has a really useful function called Autofill. Notice when I'm clicked into this cell, it's selected, there's a little box around it, and in the bottom right corner of that little box, there's a tiny little square, and you'll notice that as I mouse over that square, my cursor changes to a little plus sign. And when I moused over that little square and I got my plus sign, I can click and drag down, and Excel will fill in the following cells based on the first one that I input. Now here, it's just copied the value from my original cell into all of the other cells, but it's popped up this little option box down here that says Autofill Options. If I click into that, I can change the selection from Copy Cells to Fill Series. Now, if I wanted to see a bit more of the domain that I have, maybe I want a wider range for my values, I could say I want to count by 2s, go from -24 to -22. Now that I've input these first two values, I can select both of these cells at the same time. If you want to select more than one cell in Excel, you can just click into the first one, hold down your Shift key, and then click into another cell. And this will allow you to select any number of adjacent cells, right? So cells that are next to each other. So if I select both of these cells, again, mouse over that tiny little box in the lower right corner. When I see my cursor change to the plus sign, I can click and drag down. And now notice that Excel has used those first two cells to derive a pattern, and it's filled in the rest of the cells according to that same pattern. So it's counting by 2s all the way down. And if I wanted it to count by 5s, again, I can essentially teach it the pattern that I want it to follow. And just FYI, this autofill, it doesn't only work for numerical values, it can work for all kinds of other things as well. So it's a really useful feature to get to know. Back to our problem, I need 30 different values. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill in, right, counting by 1s. And now that I have all of my X values filled in, I can use that to generate a set of corresponding Y values. So of course, whenever we want to solve a function, find the y values, we just need to plug in the different values of x. So all I need to do here is get Excel to calculate the y value on the basis of each one of these X values. And anytime I want Excel to calculate something for me, to perform some kind of operation and generate an output for me, rather than me just putting into the cell the value that I want. If I want Excel to generate that output, I'm going to start off by typing an equal sign. So that's how I tell Excel that the value that it puts in this cell is going to be equal to the equation that I'm about to input here. So I start off with an equal sign, and then I need to copy the formula into the cell. Okay, well, the formula says negative 8x squared. Oh, now here I'm running into a little problem because, well, it is possible to put superscripts into Excel, but Excel doesn't understand the mathematical notation in the same way that we do. So in a lot of cases, we basically need to translate the way that we represent equations or numbers or calculations in mathematical notation. We have to translate that into something that Excel will understand. So for one thing, when we have an exponent, when we're raising something to a power, the way that we tell Excel to do this is by using the caret symbol that you get by pressing Shift-6. So the caret symbol is saying we're raising it to a power, like it's like a little arrow pointing up to raise to a power, and then we put in the exponent right after that. So caret 2 means raised to the second power or squared. Okay, so the rest of the function, right, plus 12x plus 300. But you know what? This is still not quite specific enough for Excel because, you and I can look at this mathematical notation and say, when I have this 8 and this x next to each other, that means I'm supposed to multiply. But with Excel, we need to spell it out for it, right? So for multiplication, we're going to use the asterisk, the little star you get by pressing Shift-8. And anytime we have multiplication, we need to make sure that we go in and add the asterisk to tell Excel to multiply. Okay, so now I've copied my formula in, I've translated each of the calculations, the operations that I want Excel to perform in a way that Excel will understand. But there's one more thing here that Excel isn't going to understand unless I really spell it out. And that is what to do with this X, right? Because again, you and I know, we look at this formula, we know we're supposed to plug in an X value anytime we see an X, and we can look at this table of information and see, oh, look, in this column here, these are all X values. But Excel just doesn't think about things that way. And this is one thing to really keep in mind, that when we read Excel, we think about tables of information and all of the cells and the columns and rows being interconnected. But Excel understands these as basically collections of independent individual cells. Excel doesn't recognize that, oh, this is a category of X values and all of these are individual X values. So if we wanted to plug in an X value, we're going to need to tell it exactly where to look, right? So here where I have this X, I'm going to get rid of the X and I'm going to put in something that will tell Excel where to find the X value that I want it to plug in, right? And this is what we call a cell reference. Notice that over here in this cell, right, it's here in column A and it's in row 2. It's like the cell has a little address that tells you exactly where it is. And this is what we call a cell reference. And you notice that because I was over here in my formula, when I clicked into that cell, it popped up that cell reference A2 and populated that right in the middle of my formula, right? Because that's a way that I can very easily get Excel to refer to other bits of data in my spreadsheet and plug them into calculations. So I tell it basically where to go look for that data. When I put in the A2 here, I'm telling Excel, go into this cell, A2, grab that value, plug it in. And I can do that by clicking in the cell, or I can just go ahead and type the cell reference in directly. So here for this other X, I'm going to type in A2. And notice that when I do this, where it says A2 here, that is sort of in blue. And if I click into, this formula box, it's showing me this highlighted cell, right, that I've used the cell A2 in there. And that's how you can tell your cell reference is set up properly. It should change color so that you know that Excel is recognizing that as a cell reference. So now I've written out all of my operations. I've told Excel where to pull that X value from that it can use in the calculation. So everything should be good to go. And there we go. I just hit enter and I have my Y value calculated for me. So now I just need to do the same thing 30 more times, well, 29 more times. But luckily, now that I've typed all this stuff in once, I won't have to do all of that work again. I can use my autofill option, right, to copy the formula into each successive cell. And actually, when I have a whole data set like this, once I've got the first one filled in, if I want to fill it in for the rest of the data set, again, I need my cell to be selected, so I'll get the autofill option, but I can just go ahead and mouse over that autofill and double click, and it'll fill in the rest of the rows for my data set. And you'll notice, right, obviously this is producing a different value every time, because as I click in to each cell, right, up here in the formula bar, you can see what is actually in the cell, what's the formula that's producing this output. As I click into these different cells, notice that the cell reference that I've used here, everything else is staying the same, but the cell reference that I've used is changing, right? When I'm in row 10, now it says A10. When I'm in row 18, now it says A18. So it's going back to this column, but it's changing the X value that it's grabbing because each time it's updating which row it looks at. And that's because when we use cell references in Excel, by default, they're what we call relative cell references. Meaning when I went in here and typed in cell A2, Excel doesn't understand that as meaning exactly this A2 cell. It understands it in relation to the cell that I was working in. So really it understood that as being the cell, one to the left of this B2 cell that I was in. So as I'm copying that formula down, it's updating that cell reference relative to whichever cell I'm currently in. And it's always looking one to the left to grab that new X value. Now, most of the time, this is really convenient because, again, it allows me to just copy my formulas and have them update automatically rather than having to put in a new value every time. Every so often, though, we actually want the value to stay the same, and we will look at how to do that in one of the upcoming questions. For now, let's go ahead and finish up this question. Now we've got our set of 30 XY coordinates, so we can move on to part B, where it says graph the function by plotting the coordinates using a scatter plot and joining the points using a trend line. So anytime I want to insert any type of chart, the first thing that I'm going to need to do is select my data. I can go to my insert menu, and over here in the center, there's a whole bunch of options of different charts that I can insert. Right? There's all different kinds listed here, and there's also this really cool menu called recommended charts. If I click on that, it's going to give me a bunch of different options based on the type of data that I have. It kind of makes an educated guess about which kind of chart I might want, which kind of chart would work well for that sort of data. The other thing that's really cool about it is that it pops up these little previews. So it's a way for you to see very quickly what your data would look like visualized in different ways. And notice the very first thing that it popped up based on the data that I have is in fact exactly what I want, right? It says to use a scatter plot and join the points using a trend line. And that is the first thing that it offered me here. So I could go ahead and click OK and just insert this chart. But just in case you looked in those recommended charts and it didn't give you what you wanted, you could also go in here and look and choose a specific type of chart, right? There's our scatter plot right there. And I could choose one that gives me just the points, but there's also one, again, that already puts in that line that is joining the points together. So I can go ahead and choose that one. And notice that your graph is sort of a curve here. And in fact, this isn't just a curve, it's the beginning of a parabola. Ideally, when you're graphing data like this, if you have a domain, it's good to try to get a sampling of points from across your domain so you get a really good idea of what the function looks like. Here we have a lot more negative points than positive points. So it kind of gives us a distorted view. But if this were going to continue, we'd see this is actually a parabola, which is perfect because, hello, this is a quadratic equation. So we know that, in fact, the graph should look like a parabola. And this is one thing to keep in mind, that with Excel, it's very easy to make little simple errors, data entry errors, that could mess up your calculations or mess up the way that your data is displaying. And so you always want to be careful, not only be really careful and sort of double check and proofread what you've input into the cells, but also sort of gut check yourself and think about, based on the data that I have, the type of problem that I'm doing, what kind of result would I expect? And does the result that Excel is giving me make sense? Right? You want to use your critical thinking skills, have an expectation of what you think your data is going to look like, and use that as a way to check that you've input everything into Excel correctly. So we finished up question number 1, and I'm going to go ahead and just click that save button just to make sure that I don't lose any of my beautiful work here. And I'm going to go ahead and move on to question number 2, and the test asks you to create a new sheet or a new tab for each question. So I'm just going to click that plus sign to get my blank sheet. And for question 2, it asks me to copy this table. So I should be able to just use my cursor to highlight the table and then copy and paste it. However, some versions of Excel I have found do give students a little bit of trouble. If this does happen to you, I found that sometimes it helps if, instead of trying to copy the whole table, you go either row by row or column by column. Sometimes that works when trying to paste in the whole table doesn't. But if that does come up, I would definitely get in touch with your instructor or talk to your fellow students about it and see if you can troubleshoot that, because, while it's fine to go row by row or column by column when you have a small table like this, once you start dealing with larger data sets, it's going to become a real issue. So you definitely want to make sure that you know how to copy in tables of information. So for question number 2, we're going to start working with the functions in Excel. The first part of the question asks me to find the mean, median, and mode age using formulas. So I'm just going to go ahead and type some labels into my cells here. And now I'm going to need to put in a function. And there's a few different ways that you can do this. If I know exactly what function I need and I know how to format it, I can go ahead and just start typing it into the cell. If I want a little help, though, I can click on this f of x button at the top, and it will open up a menu where I can go and I can search for a particular function, or it will give me a category and I can look up by type of functions. I can also do that if I go into my formulas menu. Again, it gives me these categories of financial formulas versus logical formulas versus math and trig formulas. Or over here where it says auto sum, that's going to give me just some common basic arithmetic formulas. And notice the one over here that says average, right? That's exactly the same as the arithmetic mean. So this is one of the little tricky things about these functions, is that if I don't know that the formula for mean is actually average, then it might be a little bit tricky for me, because Excel doesn't make it very easy to search through different formulas. So using these categories can be really helpful, but I'll be completely honest with you guys. Normally, if I'm not sure what the function is called that I need to use, usually the quickest way to find out is just to Google it. But notice now that I've chosen the average function, Excel automatically went and filled in some data for me, because it could see that I have a set of numbers here. I've put this function into the same column. And so it's making an educated guess that I probably want to find the average of all these numbers. And in fact, it's correct, right? So here, notice the notation. It's got a cell reference, again, C2, which is that cell up there. Then it's got a colon and C9. So colon is a way that Excel notates ranges. Right? When I put C2 colon C9, that means all of the cells between C2 and C9, right? So it's a whole range. If I wanted to do just separate cells, I would separate those by a comma, right? And now it's just cell C2 and cell C9. But if I want all the cells in between, that's when I use the colon. And of course, all the cells that it's using are highlighted for me here very nicely so I can easily see and make sure I've got the right data input there. And then I just have to hit enter and it will calculate that average for me. Now, the median, in this case, I already know what the formula is. It is, in fact, just median. So the other thing that I can do to input formulas, if I don't want to use any of these menus and such, is I can just go in and start typing in the formula again. I'm wanting Excel to generate an output for me. I want it to do a calculation and then put the result of that calculation in here. So I'm going to start off by using my equal sign. And I can go for my function. Notice once I start typing it, it already starts popping up a bunch of possibilities. And when I find the one I want, I can click on it or I can hit tab to fill it in. And then notice it pops up a little cheat sheet down here to remind me how I'm supposed to format the function, right? Every function is essentially going to look this way, where I've got my equal sign, I've got the name of the function, and then I have parentheses to enclose all of the information for the function, the data it's going to use. And then whatever inputs I need, Excel is going to remind me of down here. So I've got to at least have one number in there. I could have other numbers in there. Notice this is in brackets, so which is telling me I don't actually need it, but I do need to have at least one number there. And in fact, in this case, just like last time, I really want a whole range of numbers. So I can just do C2 colon C9. And again, it shows me which cells I've selected with those cell references. And that's everything I want. So I just close out those parentheses and I can hit enter, right? And notice, even though these are two different functions, the way it's formatted, the syntax of it is exactly the same. Equal sign, name, parentheses, data, close parentheses, right? Same thing with the average. So it's good to get to know that syntax. It's going to make it a lot easier for you later on because in some cases you may want to combine different functions together, in which case you're going to need to know how to write the functions out. Right? You won't be able to get Excel to do that automatically for you as easily. So once again, I'm going to hit my equal sign. I'm going to do mode. Mode comes in two variations, right? Multiple or single, because when you do the mode, sometimes there's more than one answer, but I'm just going to go ahead and click single. Again, I'm going to do that exact same range that I've been doing this whole time. So that's those three functions down. It also wants us to find the maximum and minimum age. So same thing. Let me just label these really quickly. And again, if I want to, I can go ahead and use these options. But notice, I gotta be careful here, right? Because now Excel doesn't realize I want to go back to my original data set and find the max in there. It thinks that I want to include all of these numbers. Now I need to adjust the data set, and I could do that by just editing this with my keyboard, or I would hold down my shift key so that it doesn't, because if I just click into this cell, it's gonna unselect all the other cells, but if I hold down my shift key and click into this cell, then it's going to keep all of these selected, right? So I can click to adjust which numbers are selected. And again, I can select a whole range of cells. Another option is I can hold down the control key, and control will allow me to select multiple cells that aren't continuous. Shift only lets you select cells that are next to each other. And if you try to click in anywhere else, again, it's just going to keep trying to figure out how to select the cells that are continuous. If I hold down control, I can select any cells I want, and they don't have to be anywhere near each other. But I'm going to select the range that I want, hit enter. Same thing for my min. Again, this time I'm just going to go ahead and type it in. Once you get familiar with the functions and you're using them all the time and you know what they are, usually just typing them in is going to be the fastest thing. And using these menu options or the little FX button right there is going to be better if you're not sure exactly what your function is or what you need to input, because that's going to give you a little bit of extra help. So here's a great example, right? Our next one is going to ask us to use a different formula. It says check the following condition in each row by using the AND function and state true or false. Right, so I'm going to go back up here because it wants me to do this in each row, and it wants me to use the AND function. Let me go ahead and use this dialog box because this is a type of function we haven't used before. It's one of the logical functions, and what the logical functions allow you to do is to create certain logical tests and have Excel check to see if the data meets certain conditions, right? In this case, it wants us to use an AND function. And so the nice thing about using that little F of X button is that it will pop up a dialog box that just makes it easier to see the different parts that you need to input for your function. It also gives you a little description. It explains what the function is. It explains what each of the inputs are. So again, if it's a function you're not used to using and it's a little confusing for you, this will give you, it's a little bit slower to use this, but it gives you a little bit of extra help. In this case, right, the AND function is going to check whether the arguments, right, the little tests that we're constructing are true or false. So here where it says logical 1 or logical 2 are the different conditions that we want to test. The first is that the major is finance, and then the second is that the age is more than 20. And again, remember what we talked about, right? I can look at this table and say, oh, obviously these are all the majors because it says major at the top. But for Excel, we need to be a little bit more explicit, right? So I'm going to put in my logical test. I'm going to tell it where to look. Excel, I want you to go over here into this cell, cell D2, which is where the major for this row is located. And I want you to check that. And in this case, I want to check if it matches, right? If it equals finance. So I'm going to use my equal sign. And the finance code here is FIN. But here's the tricky bit, right? That if I start typing in letters, Excel can get a little confused because sometimes it thinks, well, is that supposed to be a formula, a function? Is it supposed to be a cell reference? What's going on here, right? It's going to try to interpret that. But in this case, I don't need Excel to interpret it. I just want it to match and not think about what the letters mean, just match them, right? So what I'm going to do when I have a text input like that, that Excel is not meant to interpret in any kind of way or do anything with, I'm going to put quotation marks around it. And notice over here that it's already given me a little preview that that's false, right? That cell D2, in fact, is not equal FIN. What the AND function is designed to do is to check if data meets more than one criteria, right? So does it meet this condition and that condition? And maybe a whole bunch of other conditions. You don't have to just have 2 tests, you can have as many as you want. But so we've got to put in at least one more condition to have an AND, right? Because the point of the AND is that it's going to check if it meets both of those conditions. So the second condition is that the age is more than 20. So once again, I have to tell Excel where to find the age, right? Which value do I want it to check? So I'm going to go ahead and tell it use cell C2. Go into the cell, look at that value, and then we need to check to see if it's more than, greater than 20. And notice again, it's giving me a little preview to say that this one is false as well, right? No, that number is not more than 20. So if they're both false, then I know that my response should be false, right? With an AND function, it should only tell me true if both of the conditions are met or all of the conditions are met. And luckily, I've used these nice relative cell references. So now I can just go over here, mouse over my autofill, and just click and drag down. And so now all of my formulas are returning a false, but when I check on them, I can see that, in fact, the cell references are updating every time. Now that I'm in row 9, I've got D9 and C9. So I know that it is, in fact, not just copying the value, but it's doing the operation all over again. And in fact, if I take a step back and just look at my data, I can see that, yeah, well, obviously there's only one person whose major is finance, and they're not over 20. So I shouldn't be getting any truths in here. And even though I can check that and see at a glance whether this result should be true or false, to get points for this question, it's not going to be enough to just have true or false as it should be in that cell. But we're going to be looking to make sure that you have used the formulas properly. And same deal with these down here. I mean, I could calculate the average of these numbers without any trouble. I could look at them and just figure out what's the max and what's the min. But that's not really the point here, right? The point is to make sure that you're able to use these different functions in Excel, because I can do that stuff easily now because I only have 8 rows of data. But if I had 100 rows of data or 1,000 rows of data, it'd be a different story, right? So what we're really looking for is making sure that you know how to use these functions. And the logical functions are particularly useful because you can use those as a way of refining or cleaning your data. If you want to get rid of any invalid entries, you can implement a logical test that will show you where all the invalid entries are. This is a way that you can create certain subsets of data by applying the test and then sorting according to the result here. So this is a really great way of sifting through and filtering your data. Another way to just quickly filter through your data and look at subsets of data is to use the filtering option in Excel. So part D says to copy the table in the same sheet. Now we're going to make a new view of it with filters. We're going to use the filter to display only the students having the English major, right? So I'm just going to click into this table, into the header row, doesn't matter which cell. And I'm going to go into my data menu. And it gives me the option here to filter. So I'm just going to click on this icon that looks like a filter and says filter on it. And that's how I put in my filters. And notice once I clicked on that, I get all these little arrows, little drop-down boxes that I can click on. And then it gives me some options to filter and options to sort as well, right? But down here, right now, everything's selected. It's not filtering anything out. But if I uncheck that select all, then I can choose a particular one of these, right? Or this is age. We're supposed to sort by major, right? So let me go ahead and cancel that, right? Here, same thing, right? And I can apply more than one filter if I want to refine my data in different ways. But in this case, I'm just going to unselect this, and then I can go back and select just what I want, which are the English majors. So once your filter is applied, you can see the little filter icon there, so you know where there have been filters applied. So now that I've got this beautiful tables, I'm going to go up here and click Save to make sure I don't lose any of my work. And question number 3 is tricky because it has a lot of little fiddly things that you need to input into Excel. So it says find the value of R sub A if S sub M equals 4.38% and M sub M equals 1.37%. Type the values of S sub M and M sub M in separate cells and give cell references while calculating R sub A. Okay, so the first thing we've got to do is just input these values. So we've got S sub M and M sub M. S sub M is 4.38%. M sub M is 1.37%. And you want to make sure that you do incorporate that percentage, because if I just type 1.37, remember that that as a decimal value doesn't actually mean 1.37%. It means 137%, right? So if you were inputting this as decimals, you would need to convert that to 0.0137. So it does make a difference that you use the percentage sign, right? Now I can convert these, right? Another way of dealing with this, if I want to convert from percentage to decimal and vice versa, I can go into my home menu, and on the ribbon up here, there's this little formatting palette. And so notice there's a little percentage button, there's a currency. And if I click into this drop-down menu, it gives me a bunch of other options of how I can format this cell. It's a way that I can tell Excel what kind of value is contained in this cell, right? So I could put this as a percent, but the problem is, again, of course, 1.37 really means 137%. So I've got to make sure that I enter that in correctly. Now notice Excel automatically wanted to round that off for me, which is not what I want. So I can go back into that formatting palette. One of the options is to change the number of decimal places that are displayed, right? So I'm going to go ahead and go back and increase that to the 2 decimal places that I need so I can see the correct number. Okay, now we've got to calculate R sub A. I'm just going to put a label in here so I know what I'm calculating. And now again, I need to take this equation and translate it from the mathematical notation into something that Excel is going to understand. And since I'm asking Excel to do a calculation for me, the very first thing I need to do is type in an equal sign. And now the tricky part is I have a square root, but I can't use the square root symbol in Excel. So Excel instead has a function programmed in, square root, SQRT. It seems like squirt, but it's actually square root. And this is, we're going to find the square root. So this is going to take the place of my little radical symbol here. And like with all functions, remember we talked about how we always have the equal sign, the name of the function, and then parentheses, right, around all of the information that the function is using, right, or the data that the function is being applied to. So I'm going to have a set of parentheses that goes along with the notation of this function. But I also, once I start inputting the equation here, I have a bunch of parentheses in there as well, right? And this is something I'm going to have to keep those parentheses in there because Excel does know and it does follow the order of operations. So if I took that away, then it would calculate it in a different way than it's supposed to. I need to make sure that I keep all of these parentheses in there, but also that I have all of that inside the set of parentheses that I already put in there that goes along with the function notation, right? So this is going to be the trickiest part, is keeping track of all those parentheses, of all my cell references, and then making sure that I'm also translating all of the mathematical operations into the form that Excel understands, right? So I've got the square root input. I'm going to start putting in everything over here that is underneath the radical. And that starts with parentheses. So I'm going to put another parentheses in there. And then it's S sub m squared. So again, we want to use this value that we've already input, right? We're going to grab that cell reference. So we tell Excel, go over here, grab the value for S sub m and plug it in. And then we need to tell it to square that value. So I'm going to use my caret, right? Shift 6, and then put a 2, right, for the power of 2. And we've got a plus sign. We've got another parentheses. Don't forget any of those parentheses. And another plus sign. And then m sub m. So again, I'm going to use another cell reference, B2. So I'm telling Excel, go into this cell, B2, grab that value, plug it in. I've got another parentheses. All of this, so now I'm over here. I'm all the way over here. And then all of this is going to be squared. All right, so another shift 6 for that caret, telling me to the power of 2. Another parentheses, to the power of 12. Right, okay, so now I've done this whole first part. Now we've got a minus sign, another parentheses, 1 plus, and an m sub m again. So I'm going to put in one more time the cell reference B2 to tell Excel, go in here, grab this m sub m value, plug it in. And another parentheses, and that's all raised to the 20th power. And so that finishes up. I've got this whole bit from under the radical over here. And then, of course, I have to have one last parentheses to close off that square root, right? And tell Excel that it's taking the square root of all of this. So I'm just going to go ahead, click enter. And what's the problem? What's your problem now? Let's see. Okay, see, again, like the best laid plans, no matter how careful you are, it's so easy to make a mistake, and I just have to go through and very carefully proofread, and I can see somehow I missed the number 1. I've got the plus sign up in here, right from over here. I've got that plus sign and the m sub n value, but I forgot to put in the 1 somehow. So there we go. So if that does happen, if you get some kind of error in here, most likely it was just a little typo, or maybe you missed a parenthesis somewhere in there. So the thing to do is just go through very, very carefully, bit by bit, and check this. And if you absolutely need to, just, erasing it and starting again sometimes is useful. If you can't find, you keep looking and looking, but you can't find the mistake. A lot of times, this is just so hard to read. There's so many little bits in there. So sometimes just like clearing it out, starting fresh can be really helpful as well. Okay, question number 4 is asking us to fill in another table. So let's copy this. This time, instead of giving me a whole data set, it's going to ask me to fill these numbers in. It says, let FB equal PB times 1 plus the rate to the power of time. Calculate FB for corresponding rate and time where PB equals $115. Now I'm going to go ahead and, just like I did in the last problem, I'm going to put this value into a cell so that I can use a cell reference for it. So here I've got my PB is $115. And there's a couple ways that I can do this, right? It's just giving me a formula. So one thing that I could do is just ask Excel to calculate this for me and just input the formula, right? Again, so I could say equal sign, because I want Excel to calculate something. I want it to use my present value. So I'm going to tell it, go over here into cell B10, grab that value, plug it in. We're going to multiply. So I'm going to tell it Shift 8 to get my asterisk. And then 1 plus the rate. So I'm going to tell it, go over here into cell C2, grab that rate value, plug it in, parentheses, and then to the power of the time. So Shift 6, get my caret. And then I'm going to say, go on over here into cell B3, grab that time value, plug it in. So now I've translated that whole formula for Excel. Hit enter, and there we go. We've got the calculation. Let me go ahead and change this to a dollar value. Now, last time we did this, and we had a bunch of cells we need to fill in, we got to do the same thing over again. So I should be able to... No. What? Something's going on here. Right? Because remember, whenever we're copying cells like that, if we've used those relative cell references, every time I change, it updates the cell references. So up here, I can double click on this and it will show me which cells I'm using, right? I've got my rate, I've got my time, I've got my present value. That all looks great. But if I go down here, now it's moved down over here and it's not grabbing my present value anymore. Because again, this is all in relative terms. So if I move down over here, it's going to think everything needs to move down. But in this case, I don't want to move down. When I say cell B10, I mean cell B10. Thank you very much. So I need to tell Excel, right, for the cell B10, that's not a relative cell reference. It's an absolute cell reference. No matter where I am, no matter where I copy this formula to, I always want you to go back to this exact same cell. And in order to do that, right, the notation that we use for that is the dollar sign. I add dollar signs to my cell reference to indicate that these are absolute values. And I can do that by just typing them in. That works perfectly fine if I just want to type dollar signs. But there's also a nice little shortcut if I just click into that cell reference, anywhere in that cell reference, and then I can use my function keys, F4, and that automatically puts the dollar signs in for me. And notice that I've actually got 2 dollar signs in here, one in the front of the B and then one in front of the 10. And if I keep pressing F4, the first time I pressed it, it just put dollar signs in front of both of them. If I hit it again, now it's going to put dollar sign just in front of the 10. One more time, now it's just in front of the B. If I hit it again, then it will just clear it out of everything. So it's going to cycle through those different options. And the reason that it gives me those different options is because I can actually set those absolute values separately for the column and the row. So if I want to say, okay, I want to lock this into row 10 and always go back to row 10 every time, but we can move from column to column, then I would just put the $ in front of the 10. So I would just lock the row. And if I put the $ just in front of the B, right, that'll just lock the column. So then we'll keep going back to column B, but I can still change from row to row. Now this is going to be really useful because notice that I have here a two-way table that is changing depending on which direction I'm moving in. As I go from column to column, I'm changing my rate. And as I go from row to row, I'm changing my time, right? So that's something I'm going to have to be careful of. Now I have locked my present value cell so that it always will go back and grab the same present value. But that's not all I need to do, right? Because if I try to copy this now, right? Something has gone wrong. Because when you see all these little pound signs or number signs in a row, what that means is that your number is too large to be displayed in the space that you have, right? So notice I'm like, what? How big is this number? Okay, there we go. I had to zoom out to get enough space to actually show the number input here. Now again, gut check. Do we think that this is how our investment of $115 is going to work? I wish. We know something is going wrong. These numbers are way too big. They don't make sense. And if we click into the cells and double click so we can see the formula, we can see what's going wrong. That the first time it's working, it's using that 5% number for the rate. But as I move down, right, it's moving down and adjusting the time just like it should. But now it's moved down over here too. And it's trying to use that 146 for the rate instead of 5%. So let's go back. We're going to need to fix this up so that if we copy down, it's going to update the cell reference to grab the time for that row. And as we copy across this way, it's going to update the cell reference to grab the appropriate rate. Here, I'm inputting the C2, right, the rate value. And as I move across and through the different cells of my table, I notice the rate value is always here in row 2, right? It switches from column to column to column, right? D, E, F, G, H, depending on where I am, but it's always here in row 2. So for the rate notation, I am going to put a $ in front of my 2 so that I'm locking it into row 2. I'm using row 2 as an absolute value, an absolute reference. But I'm going to leave the C the way that it is because that way the column will be able to change. It can change from C to D to E. It's just going to stay in row 2 every time. Now with my other cell reference for the time value, I need to do it the opposite way, right? Because in this case, the row is going to change each time from 3 to 4 to 5, etc. But it's always going to be in column B. Right? So I'm going to put the $ in front of that B to lock it into column B, right? So it's always going back to this column to grab the value, but it can change from row to row to row. So now that I've input those restrictions, I can take this and copy it down, and hey, those values look a lot better. And now I can just drag this whole thing across. And now we can see these values make a lot more sense. So that's the way I could do this if I were filling in, no matter what the equation was, as long as it's defined for me, I can have Excel calculate on the basis of that equation. But it just so happens that the equation we're using here is actually a known formula, right? The formula for future value is one that you will probably use a lot in your finance class. And Because it's used so frequently, there's actually already a formula defined, right? We can go in here to my formula bar and look under financial, and notice one of the options here is FV, right? And that's actually the same equation that is being laid out for us here in the question. So another way that you could do the same calculation is to use the FV formula. Right, so here it's asking me for the rate. So I can just input that here. It's asking me for the number of periods, which is another way of saying the time. It's asking me for the payment, which in this case I don't have, so I can leave that blank. And then the present value, which is here. And type, again, here doesn't matter, so I can just leave that blank and fill that in. Although the weird thing about this is that for this particular formula, because it distinguishes between incoming and outgoing payments, you need to make the present value negative in order for this to come out positive. Just a little quirk of that formula. But notice that's giving me the exact same result, and that works perfectly well, but what Excel does not do, again, automatically, Excel does not recognize this as a table. It doesn't read it the same way that you and I would. So if I want to fill in this table, I'm still going to have to go in manually and input those dollar signs to make some of these absolute values and to lock the cells so that when I move horizontally and vertically to copy them, that they will update correctly. Question 5 has another table for me to copy. And this time it's going to ask me to produce a few different charts. It wants me to create 2 grouped bar graphs using the data. And it says in the first graph, include only the data for company M and company N. And set the 3 main groupings to be the years 2014, 2015, and 2016. And the next graph, we're going to flip it around and group by company instead of by year. So again, I want to select my data, go over here to insert, and again, I can choose the recommended charts and see what it gives me. And it gives me a few different options, but the very first thing that it suggests is, in fact, a grouped bar graph. And it gives me actually a couple different options for the grouped bar graph. That's very useful, right? Or I could just go ahead and go into the bar graph option. So I could just go ahead and click on this, and notice by default, it's set it up here so that it's 2014, 2015, 2016 for each of the groupings, and that's exactly what I want, but it's got the data for company P in there, and that's not what I want. For this one, I only wanted company M and company N. Now there's a couple ways that I can deal with this. One of them, if we go back to the drawing board, is that I could start off by, instead of selecting my entire table, I could select just the data that I want. So I can leave out company P since I know I don't want that included in my chart. And then when I click insert chart, it's not going to use that data. It's only going to use what I've selected. This is why it's really important to be careful when you're selecting your data to create the charts. Now that worked perfectly fine in this case because it was really easy for me to just select around that company P data that I didn't want. However, in some cases, it might not be so simple, right? In some cases, you might have sort of discontinuous ranges of data that you want to use or don't want to use that are not next to each other. And it can get a little tricky to try to select around the data. So there are a couple other ways that you can handle this. Let me get back my original chart. Again, I'm going to click insert, column, and there's a few different options that I can actually work directly with this chart to change around how I've used my data. I can go into my chart and select the different data series here, right? The data for company M, company N, and company P. And when I have the company P data selected in my chart, which I just have to click on one of these bars to select it, I can just click delete or backspace and take that right off my chart, just like that. The other option that I have is, notice that when I click into my chart, I get some little menu bars pop up over here on the right, and one of them is a filter, just like the filter that we used on the spreadsheet earlier on our table. So if I click into that filter, it gives me the option to select and deselect different ranges of data, right? So I can just go into the filter, uncheck company P, click apply. And again, now it has filtered out the data for company P, but I can always go back and recheck that again if I want to add it back in. Right, so that's a really nice option as well. One more thing for you to look at is that if I right-click on my chart, one of the options that it gives me here is called Select Data. And this gives me a dialog box with menu options that allows me to specify and edit my data series that are being incorporated into the chart. Now, this is a lot trickier to use, but I want you to know about this because this is when you can actually refine the data in much more specific ways. So when you're starting to do advanced charting, this is just a good thing to know about. And the other really cool thing that we can do in the Select Data dialog box is it has this option to switch row/column. I can click that, click OK, and notice now instead of it being grouped by year, it's now grouped by company. And that was our part B, right? That it wanted us to set the main groupings to be company M, company N, and company P. Now let me go back because we need to have both of them, right? So I'm going to go back and insert this chart again. And again, notice with my recommended charts, right? It already knew what I wanted. So I can put that one in. Now it looks like I only have one chart here, and like it replaced my other chart, but in fact, it just always puts the charts into the same spot. So they end up just hiding each other and you've just got to move them around. Okay, just 2 more questions left. We're very close to the end now. Question 6 asks us to copy this table once again. And it says, draw a scatter plot assigning variable x to the x-axis, variable y to the y-axis, then add a linear trend line, the equation, and the r-squared value to the chart. So just like question 1, I've got a set of x values, a set of y values, and I just need to put in a scatter plot. So I'm going to select my data. Again, I'm going to click into the top left cell of this table and hold down my shift key and then click into the bottom right, and that's going to select all of the cells in between. I'll click Insert, and then I'll choose a scatter plot. Now, in this case, I don't want a line that's just connecting my points. I want a linear trend line that's going to be a best fit. So I'm just going to select the normal scatter plot. And now we just need to add a trend line. So to add chart elements, when you click into your chart, you should get this little pop-up menu over here for Add Chart Elements. And then you can click into that. And it'll give you the option to add a trend line. If for some reason you don't see that little pop-up, you can also go into the chart design menu, which should be popped up here automatically once your chart is selected. And then over here, you have the option to add chart elements. So either way, I'm going to want to go in and add a trend line. And so now my trend line's on there, but I want Excel to tell me what is the equation and the r-squared value represented by that trend line. So what I'm going to do is under the same place with the plus sign where it says trend line, if I just mouse over that, it gives me a little arrow for more options. And if I click into that, right, it gives me different possibilities, but then I can also choose more options. Same thing if I'm using the chart design ribbon up here. If I go into add chart element and down to trend line, at the bottom, it gives me an option for more trend line options. So these are both going to open up a sidebar. And again, it gives you those different options for different types of trend lines. But at the very bottom, it also gives you an option to display the equation on the chart and to display the r-squared value. So all you have to do, once you know where those are, this is super easy. You just have to check those 2 boxes. Now, the second part of the question asks us to find the slope and intercept. Now notice up here, I've already got the equation for that trend line written, and it's in y equals mx plus b format. So actually, I already know what the slope and the intercept are, right? The slope is the coefficient of x here, that 2.31, and then the y-intercept is this 1.9091 number here. But in this case, we also want to show that we can find these using functions in Excel. So I've put in some labels here. And if I want, I could go, into my function menu, find the slope formula. There we go. And then it'll tell me exactly what I need to put in, right? I need to put in my range of known y's. So I'm going to go over here and select all of these values in the y column. And then I need to put in my known x's. I'm going to select that range right there. And there we go. So it's found my slope, and I can check this for myself because I already know what the slope is, 2.31. Yes, we have a match. So we're just going to do pretty much the exact same thing for the intercept. This time I'm going to go ahead and just type this formula in because I already know it's the intercept formula. I'm going to use my equal sign, start typing in intercept. There we go. And once again, we just need to put in the known y's, right? We've got our little cheat sheet down here, known y's. I put a comma and then the next element, which are the known x's. And again, I can check myself. 1.90, 1.90, yes. This one, again, it's really useful to be able to check yourself like this because you could make a very easy mistake, which is to swap out the x's and y's, right? It asks you to put in the y's first and then the x's. So if you notice these numbers aren't matching up there to what you got in the equation, that's a pretty good sign that you probably input the data incorrectly. And that's the first thing I would check is, did you actually swap your X and Y ranges and where they're supposed to go? Okay, last one, everybody. And this one is going to be a little bit trickier, but it's built in on everything we've already done. We're going to copy in this table. And then it says create a column number next to the column hours. And check using the function if cells under the column hours contain numbers. The function should return true if the cell contains a number, else false. And we have a little hint here. It says to use the function ISNUMBER, which is exactly what it sounds like. It really just checks, all this function does is checks to see if the value in a particular cell is a number, right? So since I already know what my function is, let me just go ahead and type that in. I'm going to start with my equal sign. I'll type in ISNUMBER. And then I just need to tell it where to find the value that I wanted to check. So I'm going to use that cell reference. Tell it go into cell A2, grab that number, plug it in. And it's giving me a value of true because, in fact, of course, 5,000 is a number. And I've used that relative cell reference. So now I can just copy this all the way down and it's going to update every time. And again, I can take a quick look through these and just double check. Yes, in fact, my cell reference is updating every time and it matches up to the row number. And I can also take a quick look at this data and just see, like, yes, I'm getting trues for my numbers and I'm getting falses for text. Now part B wants us to create a new column, valid hours, next to the column number. And I'm going to use a new function, the if function, in combination with the ISNUMBER function to generate the same cell values as an hours if it's a number, else return not a number. Right? So we have to figure out how to put together two different formulas. This is the only part that we haven't really done before, right? But once you know how to use the formulas and you're really clear on what the syntax of the formulas is supposed to look like, that makes it a lot easier to combine the formulas. Just so I can make this a bit easier on myself, I'm going to go ahead and use the function menu. I'm going to use the if function. So it's going to pop me up my little dialog box. And here it explains the if function is going to check whether a condition is met. And then it's going to return one value of true and another value is false, right? With the ISNUMBER function, it just gives me a true or false, and that's all it's going to do. But if I want it to give a particular value, a certain output, depending on whether it passes the test or not, that's what the if function is really useful for. So it's going to ask me to put in my logical test. Now, this logical test could be anything. Say I want to check to see if cell 2, again, equals the number 20, something like that, right? But in this case, what I'm going to put into my logical test is actually another function, right? I'm going to use the ISNUMBER function, and I'm going to use it exactly like I would if I was just inputting this right into the cell. I'm going to use it exactly like I did when I created this column B for number. Right? I'm going to use the function itself, ISNUMBER, parentheses to enclose the information or the data that's used with that function. And then with the ISNUMBER function, I have to tell it what value to check, right? So I'm going to tell it, hey, go into cell A2, grab that value, plug it in, check to see if it's a number. Everything I've got in here is just exactly what we did in the last step. And the only extra piece I'm adding is that by putting this inside of an if function, right, I'm going to do that same check that I did, but then if it's true, I can tell it exactly what I want it to do, right? If it's true, then I want it to generate the same cell values as in hours. So I want it to copy the value from cell A2. So I'm just going to put A2 in there. We're going to tell it, grab that value, plug it in. But if it's false, I want it to give me this phrase, right? Not a number. So under value of false, I'm going to type in that phrase. But remember, anytime I want Excel just to match some text and not to try to interpret what it means, I'm going to put it in quotation marks. So I'm going to put that whole phrase there in quotation marks in my value is false field. And now I've got everything I need, so I can click OK. And it worked, right? Because this is in fact a number, so it just copied in that same value. So notice if we look up here, right, into our formula bar, it shows us exactly what the formula is that produced that output. I've got right in the center here, my ISNUMBER formula, exactly like it looked, when I put it into this cell. And then all of that, that's my logical test. Then I've got a comma. And then here's the other stuff that I need for the if function, right? The value of true, comma, the value of false. All of that is inside of parentheses to go with the if function. So just to go through that one more time, if I were going to type this in, I would do the if, and I'd open up the parentheses for the if function. And now for the logical test, I just need to put in the ISNUMBER function, exactly as I would use it otherwise, right, with its value. And notice once I started typing in the ISNUMBER function, right, when I was over here, it's popping up for me this little cheat sheet for how to format the if function. But once I start typing in the ISNUMBER, now it's changed it and it's giving me the little cheat sheet for the ISNUMBER function. So I remember exactly how that's supposed to look. And then once I'm done putting in the ISNUMBER function, it goes back and starts reminding me what I need for my if function. So value of true, again, it's going to, this needs to be A3 because we've moved down a row. The value of true, again, is going to copy A3. And then the value if false, again, is going to be that phrase, not a number. In quotation marks, close the parentheses, and we're done. And now we can just fill that in the rest of the table. Make this look a little bit nicer, because here I've got decimal places, the decimal place here, but just one of them. And then over here, there's no decimal places. So let's even that out. I'm going to just select my data in here, go over to the General tab, and increase the decimal places. Oops, that's one too many, so that I have 2 decimal places each time. So there we go. We've gone step by step through how to use a bunch of different functions in Excel, but it's going to be really important that you practice. Practice makes perfect. And with Excel, a big part of using it effectively is getting used to where everything is, first of all, getting used to how to input these different formulas, and having that become second nature for you. But also, when it comes to these things like the charts where you have a bunch of different options, to kind of play around with those and start to get comfortable and see what the different possibilities are. We do have tutors available both for Excel skills and for Finance 320 specifically. So I will put the information for the tutoring center in the info box. Definitely check that out if you want to make a one-on-one appointment with the tutor. They can help you work on these problems, or you can reach out to me if you have any other questions.